All right. Thanks, everyone. Away we go. So welcome to our NEM Reform Program General Stakeholder Briefing. I'll just start with the welcome to country, and I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of country throughout Australia and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and culture, and pay my respect to their elders past, present and emerging, and to the Wattarong people on whose lands I am at present. We have quite a lot to get through this afternoon. Let's perhaps turn to the introductory slide. Just a couple of remarks from me from an introduction point of view. This is very much an overview session today, and we've got potentially quite a lot of stakeholders joining us. We have representatives of small participants, of vendors, of industry service providers, consultants, large participants with indirect involvement in the NEM reform program. We welcome you all and really hope you get something out of this. What we're aiming to do here is to provide a condensed and short snapshot or overview of the NEM reform program. It's a complex program. There's a lot going on, and we're very well aware that it's a very, very busy time within the industry more broadly. So we're hoping we can provide you with a snapshot that helps you understand where you need to get involved if you're not already involved, and whether you need to make inquiries within your business or whether you need to perhaps get more deeply involved in the reform program itself. Certainly, we hope that is an outcome. And if you're here just for general information, we really hope that we can inform you as well. In this session, firstly, we are focused on implementation of the reforms here. We are not focused on the policies themselves. The policies and the rules have landed, and if you have questions on those, we will have trouble answering them today. And we'll probably refer you off to the AMC determinations for the policy position, very much focused on implementation. Secondly, we are focused on the initiatives that have been committed. We call them the in-flight initiatives. They are in execution, various stages of execution, and we'll focus on those. We do have a second session coming directly after this one, which is a briefing on the roadmap, and that is much more a planning session to help you look at the sort of things that are coming down the road potentially over the next sort of 3 to 5 years, subject to regulatory determinations. And so painting the sort of the more longer term picture for you so you can help understand where you might need to mobilise your resources to respond to those reforms. Happy to take feedback and questions. If you do have questions, can you please pop them in the chat? We have allowed some time at the end for questions. I don't know whether we'll suck that up by running a little overtime. If we do start to run a little overtime, I will be probably shutting the questions down and asking you to shoot them through to us via email, and we'll take them offline. All right, with that having been said, let's perhaps turn to the agenda. We will start with an overview and then we will run through the in-flight initiatives. We're going to aim to talk to you about what our best understanding is of the impacts to industry participants to hopefully make this real for you in terms of where to pay attention on these particular reforms. And we'll talk about some work we've got going on with what we call our foundational and strategic initiatives, and then we'll close with some next steps and how to get involved. With no further ado, I suggest we get into the context and program overview, and I'll hand over to David Reynolds to take us through that. Thanks, David.
Thanks, Peter, and welcome everyone to today's general briefing on the NEM reform program. My name is David Reynolds. For anyone who mightn't be familiar with me or haven't met along the way, I'm the manager for I'm the external engagement manager for the NEM reform program. So I'll talk to you through the context and background of this program. In this slide, really, it's two things. The background, the Energy Security Board, who you are all no doubt familiar with, made recommendations for the redesign of the NEM as part of their post-2025 project, and those recommendations were made in July 2021. Now, National Cabinet, having approved those recommendations in October 2021, so AEMO, in recognition of that approval and also in recognition of the cumulative regulatory implementation burden that we're all experiencing, formed the Reform Delivery Committee in November 2021, and that with the aim of navigating those Energy Security Board reforms over the coming years, with a view to de-risking, minimizing implementation costs, and informing implementation timing. That resulted in our initial NEM reform implementation roadmap being formed, which we'll speak to you in session 2 today in more detail. So the other item, I guess, by way of background, is the NEM 2025 program, as it was known at the time, was determined a declared NEM project by AEMO in September 2022, so last September. And a declared project is designed to ensure that the costs associated with the implementation of that program are recovered from the appropriate parties in line with the fee principles outlined in the rules. Now, the project has recently changed its name from the NEM 2025 Reform Programme to the NEM Reform Programme. And that's an important point because that better reflects the scope of the programme, which is much broader than the scope of the ESB's original work programme. And so, in terms of looking at the scope of this programme, as I've got on screen here, you can think of the scope of the programme comprising of 3 key areas. And those key areas are the ESB reform initiatives, foundational and strategic initiatives, and other initiatives. Now, the ESB initiatives fall into 4 interrelated pathways as presented on screen. The resource adequacy mechanisms, essential system services, transmission and access, DER, and flexible demand as the 4 kind of key pathways. And they're complemented by a data strategy which recognizes the critical importance of data and digitalization in enabling those key pathways. Now, the foundational and strategic initiatives are kind of in addition to the ESB reform initiatives, and those are initiatives that AEMO has identified. They're kind of a subset which represent investments that will, one, uplift the base capability upon which those reforms are dependent, and also, by way of identifying opportunities for delivery efficiencies that can be realized across the program. So that kind of represented there by the 2 gray components against foundational and strategic initiatives. Then we've got a host of other initiatives that don't neatly fall into any of those categories above. And that third category of initiatives really are initiatives that I guess they don't fall into the ESB or the AEMO strategic thinking, but they're rather the result of things like AMC rule changes. For example, the standalone power systems would be an example there, or government directives around consumer data rights, for example, is one that falls into that category. Now, the key message and the key takeaway from this slide is the NEM reform program is much broader than the ESB reform initiatives. It includes foundational and strategic thinking done by AEMO and a host of other reforms that are afoot. Next slide, please, Leonard. So in terms of looking at the program overview, just dialing up the resolution a little bit, the following diagram really shows the scope of the NEM reform program. It brings you down a resolution from the previous slide. And this expanded view kind of it expands those high level categories that we talked about earlier. So in terms of the foundational in the gray on the left hand side, the AEMO foundational initiatives, they're really looking at legacy systems to deliver an uplift in that base capability on which those reforms are dependent. As you move from left to right, the resource adequacy mechanisms, that's looking for investment in the right mix of resources and making sure that that's in place, prior to any anticipated plant closures, and so that we don't see any exits which cause significant price or reliability shocks to consumers throughout that transition. Essential system services and ahead mechanisms will be familiar to plenty of you. They're resources and services that are available when needed to manage the kind of complexity of dispatch and deliver secure and reliable supply to consumers and customers. Transmission and access, the integration of CER and flexible demand. That's really looking at new opportunities being created for consumers about how they receive and use energy and how they're rewarded for doing so flexibly. In terms of transmission and access, making sure that the network is capable of meeting the future demands of the power system. So looking at providing for appropriate investment signals to support investment so that it can deliver the energy transition at the lowest cost. In terms of the data strategy, really the objectives there are managing those those changing data needs throughout the energy transition. So you can see a whole host of network visibility, electric vehicles, bill transparency, and data services, and also to optimize the long-term interests of energy consumers as we move through that more digitalized economy. The retail and BAU initiatives I'll speak to a little bit later, but to close off on the AEMO strategic initiatives, they're strategic investment in kind of system uplift, which is required at some time in the future, and where AEMO sees the opportunity for that type of investment to be, brought forward and delivered within the same time frame of the reforms for efficiency purposes. So just a strategic opportunity move there to see some uplift in those capabilities. We've highlighted here on this slide the initiatives in bold that are committed, as Peter spoke to earlier. These the range of initiatives that you see on this screen represent initiatives at various stages, some in policy development, some in conceptual design, some in various stages of implementation, and we'll speak to those stages throughout today's presentation. Next slide, please, Leonard. So in terms of looking at the project, again, another resolution, we'll develop the resolution again and just look at the project timeline over 23 and 24. So really, and this slide not just lays out the timeline, but also the status of the various initiatives. So I guess immediately what you'll notice is we've got quite a busy schedule for 2023. There's a number of releases scheduled for May, June, August, September, and October. So quite a bit happening. Some of the key points, I guess, regarding this slide is we've introduced we've categorized these initiatives by release. So it's language you may see throughout today's conversation and throughout this program going forward. So looking at our March releases in the table, in the grey table beneath the linear timeline, I'll just speak to the releases across the board. I won't go through all of these in detail. The March releases saw the delivery of SAP's MSRP registration and the initial release of the IESS system, which all went off on the end of March. In looking at the May releases, we can see that we've got some pressures in that schedule. AEMO have made the decision to delay the SAPS component of the May release to the 19th of June, following its May go live assessment. Now, all other non-SAPS components of that May release, the CDR, B2B version 3.8 and ICS remain on track for their intended go live date of May the 30th. Stepping into August, we've got some pressures around AEMO testing. Similarly, in October, we're seeing some testing pressures again around FF4, 5-minute load profile and increased MT-PASA information remain on target. In terms of November, we are seeing things track reasonably well with metering exemptions and the CDR, consumer data rights. And then through June, again, some pressure that we're dealing with in the IESS initiative, and the frequency performance payments, again, looking pretty good from today's perspective. So I think the key emerging, just speaking more broadly, the key emerging challenges that we're kind of seeing from our side are things like SME capacity, or subject matter expert capacity. We've got some environment challenges, around testing, and additionally resourcing continues to be a key challenge for this project, which I'm sure is no surprise, and a challenge no doubt experienced by industry more broadly. Next slide, please, Leonard. I was going to hand back to you, Peter, but it looks like it's me again.
Yeah, thanks, David. We did have one question come through in the chat. Are the foundational and strategic initiatives tied to regulation? And I think, Carlo, thank you for your question. I think the answer to that question is they do not have a direct regulatory obligation coming through the AMC process, but the actual initiatives themselves will generally be tied to other, they're kind of supporting initiatives or foundational initiatives, if you like, to help deliver more effectively some of the other reforms that are going on. We'll see a little bit more of the detail of that when we talk to those initiatives a bit further down in the session. David, yep, thank you. Back to you to give us a little bit of overview. We'll do a deeper dive now into the initiatives and impacts to industry. What I would say is the content of the slides is quite information rich, and we're certainly not going to dive sufficiently deep into them to cover everything that's on the slides, but I certainly hope the slides give you some really helpful context for you to go back and have a look at as and when relevant to your particular circumstances. Dave, back to you.
Thanks, Peter. So I'll take you through the next section, which, as Peter has mentioned, is the initiatives and impacts to industry. So really, we can pop on to the next slide, Leonard, if that's okay. What this section really is aiming to do is outlining that high-level kind of overview of the initiatives that we've already presented, which I've appreciated very quickly presented to you all. So we'll provide a brief overview of those initiatives and outline some of the high-level impacts that we've identified for the key participant types. We will focus just on the committed initiatives in this section. Now, I guess what we're asking here really is to consider what the high-level impacts that we've identified mean for your businesses, for your organization, given the role that your organization plays in the NEM, and whether or not a more detailed impact assessment may be required, or and/or implementation or involvement may be required based on the information that you see today might prompt further action in respect of that. Now, the information that we are presenting in this session is very much general in nature. It's very much AEMO's perspective. So we would encourage industry participants to undertake their own due diligence to assess what those impacts mean for their respective businesses. Now, how have we gone about pulling this together? Well, in this section, we have undertaken our own internal assessment. So we've, gone around the business with our SMEs, our subject matter experts, and worked through what we believe the impacts could look like for various businesses. We have undertaken participant impact assessments through the Reform Delivery Committee, one of our engagement forums that has been stood up as part of this program. And we've also got participant feedback through the NEM Reform Forum, so the broader set of engagement forums that we've stood up in addition to bilateral discussions with industry. So we've taken all of the information across those broad three categories and kind of given it our best shot, our best perspective on what the impacts look like based on our understanding of, based on our perspectives. So next slide, please, Leonard. Retail and BAU initiatives. Now, this is the category of initiatives, and we can pop on to the next slide, Leonard, that fall into that other category. And we've just got a list here of the timing. Again, these are the release dates along the left-hand side of your screen. So looking at the May releases, B2B procedures, what does that mean for industry? Well, that's a defined method of managing de-energization and re-energization service orders when there are two or more service providers, the DNSPs or market customers who may have undertaken or will undertake the de-energization to better mitigate the risk of customers being left off supply. So B2B is one coming out at the 30th of May. In addition, the implementation for rule change proposals, the ICFs to drive efficiencies in retail electricity in the business to market processes, and additionally the B2B business to business and business to market or 43 schema deploys. And I won't go through all the information in that slide. As Peter said, this is quite information heavy. I'll just speak to the main points. 19th of June, the standalone power systems. That represents the shift, which was previously the 30th of May. It's a national framework some of you may be familiar with that facilitates the provision of standalone power systems by distribution network service providers to their existing customers, and go live is aiming for 19th of June. 1st of October, 5-minute load profile. That's looking at changes to the existing methodology to manage risks with a combination of positive and negative values that can produce very high or very low profile values after applying the 5-minute load profile to 30-minute and 15-minute metering data. Stepping through November, we'll see metering installation exemptions, automation commencement, which really is looking at the automation of metering installation exemption processes for meter malfunctions and small customer metering installation, and that is commencing on the 1st of November. Again, on the 1st of November, we'll see the Consumer Data Right Tranche 3 commencements, which is an integration with all retailers above 10,000 customers, excluding some of the complex requests. And the data population commencement is the Consumer Data Right MSATs LCCD field population obligations coming into effect. MSATs meaning Market Settlement and Transfer Solutions, LCCD being the last consumer change date, field population obligations commencing on the 1st of November 2023. So just a flash through some of the business, the BAU and retail components that we have, initiatives that we have afoot, and some of the changes, and I guess would ask participants to think about what some of those changes mean for their respective businesses if they haven't already begun to do so. That was it from me, Peter, and I'll hand back to pause for questions or hand back to you for the next section.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. I don't think we have any questions on that at this stage, so let's continue on, and I'll hand over now to Paul Johnson to run us through some of the wholesale market initiatives. Paul.
Yeah, look, thanks, Peter, and good afternoon, everybody. For those that don't know me, my name's Paul Johnson. I'm part of AEMO's stakeholder engagement team. I have this afternoon the privilege or opportunity to talk briefly about 3 initiatives. The first one being fast frequency response, or known as FFR. The second one being the MT PASA enhancements. And the third one being frequency performance payments, or abbreviated to FPP. We've jumped to the first slide on the fast frequency response. Thanks, Leonard. Once again, I won't go through and read all this, but just a bit of background. The introduction of the FFR, as has a lot of these initiatives, they're a result of an AEMC rule change. In this particular case, it was to introduce services to control frequency. The services were to provide additional very fast and very fast emergency response frequencies, which were to exist alongside the existing frequent ancillary service frequencies, the services that were available currently. Now, this is important because as we move into a different technologies within the grid, we do need these services to react faster and be available. The services will come into effect from the 9th of October 2023, to which case we'll then implement a number of services and have those available for the F-gas providers. A little bit of brief history on the left-hand side of the slide there. I think most of us will recall we have concluded the mass consultation that was back in October last year. And then going forward with this one, the FFR, the next step was we have released draft technical specifications, which allows the participants to upload data and have a look at what's needed to be done in those fields. With pre-production 20th of April, that was provided, with the production being released, planning for the 23rd of May 2023. The next item is what's called the service commencement plan, and that is actually being released today. Those that get AEMO Communications newsletter, I encourage everybody to subscribe to AEMO's communication newsletter. We'll see there is an article there and a link which will provide you to the service commencement plan, which is being released today. It's basically outlined the approach of how we're going to facilitate the process of getting this service into effect, and outlines all those sorts of conditions and describes how we will transpire across to it. The next stage point on this FFR is the registration commencement date, which is the 9th of August. That's planning where we will take on registrations for people that will be taking part in this service and providing this service to the grid. And finally, the rule will commence on the 9th of October as targeted. I got a couple of questions, but what I might do is jump to the second slide, and then I'll come to questions after the second slide. So if we can jump to the next slide, thanks, Leonard. This slide is just a high-level breakdown of how market systems and processes will be or may be affected by the introduction of this FFR. As you can see, the retail and metering is not affected. The registration, bidding, dispatch, and settlements are all low impacts. And it also indicates a bit of a layout of which of the particular participants may be affected from these areas. Okay, I've got a couple of questions in the box. So do you want me to handle those now, Peter?
Paul, I think there's only one that's relevant to fast frequency response. And yes, I think handling that now would be good. That's the question from Kate Reid.
All right. What I may need is Carla. You may have to help me on this one because I know you're online. So I'm not sure if you want to take this question.
I am here. Hi, everyone. So Kate, in answer to your question, yes, the very fast contingency FCAS services, both raise and lower, will be the cost recovery arrangements are the same as for the other existing contingency FCAS services. So this was something that was set out in the rule change itself. In terms of documentation, we do have our data model, which shows how the data model changes that will set out the settlement and other elements that are changing in response to the rule change. And I guess, yes, so the settlements element of this table also gives some detail around the changes to settlement reports as a result.
Thanks,
Carla. Thanks, Paul.
If there's no other questions on the FFR, we might jump to my second topic, which is MT passer enhancements. If you can jump to the next slide, that'd be fantastic. Thanks, Leonard. Okay, the increased MT passer project. There's a requirement for increased MT passer information to be provided to AEMO. The timing for this is going to be the 9th of October. That's when it will come into effect. The project was established as part of the NEM 2025 reform program. It's as a result of that, AEMO instigated a rule change, which highlighted the lack of detailed information on generation availability that we had and how that was becoming an issue. We needed it partly because the rapid change to what's happening in the NEM generation as more renewable energy and generation enters the market leads to a number of challenges. And you know, the challenges you can read it later on in there, but it's basically need for more information to understand about potential generators, where they are, what state they're in, particularly about when they're unavailable, how long those generations will be unavailable, and when they'll come back online. So it is really just an initiative to get enhanced information that we already get some information, but this is really to enhance that information, such as the state of the unit and unit recall time, which allows AEMO to make better decisions on how this all comes about. I might jump onto the next slide. Once again, this is another high impact view of how the MT passer will affect various market systems. As you can see, it's really just in the bidding and dispatch area that will be affected. As mentioned, MT passer information is already supplied. This is just additional MT passer information being supplied. And as you can see, it affects mainly scheduled generators and scheduled loads along with TNSPs. Once again, mentioned this is due to come into force on the 9th of October of this year. Any questions on the MT passer enhancements? Okay, that looks good. So let's jump to the next slide, which I think is my third topic, which will be frequency performance payments. And we'll go to the next slide. Thanks, Leonard. There we go. Look, I thought we'd just put the slide in here to give a bit of background on frequency performance payments. It was as a result of an AEMC's final determination on the primary frequency response initiative rule change, which they made back in September 2022, required AEMO then to begin implementing some of those determinations. Now, what that required us was to create a system of what we call positive and negative frequency performance payments, which will this new system will replace the current cause of pay system. And at this stage, it's targeted for June 2025 to come into play. In a nutshell, basically what this means is participants will receive payments for their facilities where their PFR, which is primary frequency response, helps to reduce the frequency deviations that would normally require regulated FGAS or frequency control auxiliary services divisions. The two documents that are probably related to this, the first one is the primary frequency response requirement procedure. That was finalised and published on the 4th of May, and it's available on our website. And the second one is the new frequency contribution factors procedure. That is required to be available by the 8th of June this year. Might hop to the next slide. Thanks, Leonard. So this is once just outlining some of the key dates and the scope of the project. As mentioned, 4th of May, that saw the final the final procedure being published for the primary frequency response requirement. And the next one being, as I mentioned before, by the 8th of June this year, we will also publish the frequency contribution factor procedure. Now, this will outline the calculations used to determine those payments, the meeting requirements, and the need for rise and lower of power system frequency. The next two, which is July 24 and November 24, are basically the technical data model specifications. The first one in July 24 relates to reporting. That'll be when that's released with updated data. And the second one in November 24 relates to the settlement side of it, which also will contain the updated data that's needed. The thing with this program, we will also be running what we call a non-financial operation of the new systems. It'll be non-financial. It'll be there to test the system to see how it works. And we plan to run that between October 24 to around April 25. And that's to test it, to make sure everything does work correctly. And as mentioned, it is a non-financial operation of that system. All going to plan. It should come live 8th of June 2025, where the new operations will come into place. And as mentioned before, they will replace the existing cause of pays arrangements. And I'll jump to the next slide. Thanks, Leonard. This is just another indication of the high level impacts across the market systems and processes, also indicating the likely stakeholders that may be impacted from it. As you can see, most of the impacts we've rated as low against the existing systems. Settlements is a little bit more moderate, as it will require probably a few more things that need to be done in that settlement area. So on that, I will ask, is there any questions on the frequency performance payments?
Fantastic, Paul. Thank you very much for that run through. We'll turn our attention now to the Integrated Energy Storage Systems Initiative, and we'll hand over to Ulrika. Thanks, Ulrika.
Good afternoon, all. Great to see so many people made the time to join this session today. I'm a principal engagement advisor, like Paul, with the AEMO's NEM reform program, and I support a couple of initiatives that I'll speak to today. So I start with the Integrating Energy Storage project, and with me in the background is Emily Brody, who's the business lead for IS, who will help me answer questions that you may have. So let's jump into it. Next slide, please. Great. So this could be, this is a high level timeline and scope, I suppose, for IES. And this could be a reminder or an introduction, depending on whether you've joined our previous sessions on the implementation of integrated energy storage systems. So I'll start with the top line there. To understand the scope of IS, it may help you to think of it as 4 rule changes in one that together help integrate energy storage and hybrid facilities better into the national electricity market. And I'll step through this on a very high level. So the gray boxes that you see on the screen cover activities that have been completed to date. And that includes the rule determination by the AMC back in 2021, AEMO's high-level design for the implementation, and the first commencement date, which happened in March this year, after which small generation aggregators can apply to provide contingency auxiliary services in the NEM. So those are the completed activities, but the next key date that's coming up this year is on the 9th of August, where the eligible hybrid or aggregate facilities will be able to opt in for so-called aggregate dispatch conformance, which basically means that more flexibility is given in their dispatch of energy between a combination of generating units rather than on a unit per unit basis. So the next, and this arrangement, I suppose, facilitates firming of the more variable renewable energy. The next milestone after that, on the 2nd of June, is a mandatory change to settlements, which, and I should make this clear, the first 2 milestones in March this year and in August are optional for eligible participants. When you look at the next couple of changes in the 2nd of June and 3rd of June, they're mandatory for most participants, but I'll cover some of the detail there when we get to the next slide. So on the 2nd of June, there will be a change to settlements and notably the non-energy cost recovery framework. So the key piece here is we're moving to a category-based energy calculation. We're moving from a category-based energy calculation to an energy direction-based direction. And instead of whether someone is a generator or a customer, the new calculation will focus on whether energy is sent out or consumed. And then lastly, the milestone on the 3rd of June is when the overarching rule, the IES rule, becomes effective, and the final changes therefore also come into effect. And this includes the introduction of a new participant type. So that's the integrated resource provider, or IRP, which, among other things, simplifies registration for batteries, but it applies to a broad range of scenarios, all of which you can take a look at in the overview of IRP classification, which I've supplied in the Appendix B references section of this pack. So the other aspect that's also introduced as part of the 3rd of June changes is the bidirectional unit, which is intended to make it easier for grid scale batteries to register, bid, and be dispatched. So we might just move on. Thank you. Yeah, so this overview, I won't talk through this in detail, but for those of you who are new to the IES implementation, it's a helpful reference for you to look at some of the details of the milestones that I've just talked through. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. Wonderful. So we'll take a look at the indicative impacts to industry of each of the changes that we've talked about. So I'm going to assume here that as a listener, you're sort of familiar with how this framework works. At this stage, I won't step through the table in detail, but focus on the key callouts for IESS. So I'll just look at the indicative participant change impact column there, and starting with registration. So we're seeing that there is a potential high impact for hybrid or aggregate facilities, those that are opting in to aggregated dispatch conformance. but again, noting that this is an optional change. We are also seeing moderate impacts for small generation aggregators where they transition to the IRP category. And this is a change that will be facilitated with AEMO and will work through you on the process of transitioning. Moving on to the bidding and dispatch section. So the impacts here are assessed as high. And in particular, if you're an existing aggregate system and you want to opt into aggregated dispatch conformance, there are potential control system impacts that you will want to get across, and they're related to your individual connections agreements. And if you're an existing battery, there are high impacts to data model and bidding interfaces. And the design for this is being worked through with impacted participants at the moment and will, for example, be presented to the NEM Reform Implementation Forum here at the end of May. Next line down, for retail and metering, the impacts can be described as moderate, and it accommodates the new classification of the bidirectional unit and the integrated resource provider registration category. And there are lower level changes as well. For example, to the way SGAs are reflected, and for the NEM classification codes for standing data, we're accommodating the new bidirectional units. And there are changes to the existing NEMs, NEM classification codes, and there will be new ones introduced as well. And these changes flow through to the interfaces there and the RM reports. And I might just call out that under retail and metering, the changes there are in consultation currently with a draft report to be published on the 12th of June. So after my presentation, I might just include a link to this consultation in the chat for those who are interested. And finally, looking at the settlements line there, the key piece is, as mentioned, that we're moving to a category. We're moving a category-based energy calculation to an energy direction-based calculation, and this is also a mandatory change with high level of impacts to market customers in the NEM. And we're engaging closely with the impacted participants on this at the moment to gauge their level of impacts. And we're hearing that not only are there impacts to the settlements function for participants, the impacts are greater than initially realized, and there are potentially considerable impacts to other operational areas as well that draw that data from the SetGen and SetCP settlement tables, which is what they're called. And that could be, for example, within the forecasting or strategy areas. So AEMO is seeking participants' feedback on these changes and how they are best supported through the Program Consultative Forum and Implementation Forum currently. And you'll learn more about these forums if you're not already familiar with them in a little bit. Next slide, please. Wonderful. Okay. So you'll see this little framework towards the end of this presentation as well. But for IES in particular, because of the breadth and depth of changes that we're looking at, I'd really encourage you to consider these impacts and how they may apply to you, and consider whether there's a more detailed assessment required against all areas. And specifically, please consider checking the areas affected by the removal of the SetGen and SetCP settlement data tables and the introduction of new tables. And there's some links there as well in the appendix to where you can learn more. So that was the IES initiative. Are there any questions? Peter, was there anything in the chat that you could see?
Yeah, thanks, Ulrika. Yes, there is something in the chat. We have a question from Rob. What happens if those consultation changes don't get over the line?
Okay, Emily, are you online to address this?
I am. I can respond to that. So Rob, I'm not sure if you're referring specifically to the IESS changes or the other change request matters that were considered in this bulk consultation. In relation to IESS only, we've had stakeholder feedback that the changes are largely okay. And I think the draft will be coming out in early June, and we're pretty confident that the responses to the stakeholder feedback will be accepted. If they aren't, and we get some unexpected feedback on the IESS changes, I think the next step would to be go back to the ERCF and talk through what the sticking points would be and get a mitigation plan sorted out from there. I hope that is okay.
Thanks, Emily. We have a new question has come through for either yourself, Emily, or for Ulrika. When will the data model changes be available for IESS?
Sure. So at the moment, we are in the planning stages, and our current plan is to release the data model in March 2024. We're also cognizant that we've had some early feedback from participants that this is not soon enough. So currently we are looking for participant feedback on what you need and when, so that we can factor that into our planning.
Great, thanks, Emily.
I think there might have been an additional question from Jeff Roberts, unless that was already addressed.
It's a statement. Yes, that's right. Thanks, Rob. Jeff.
All right. Any further questions on IESS?
Sorry, if I can just address Jeff's comment. What would be really helpful is if you could please explain. So if you could please just flick us a quick email at IESS so that we have the information about what industry needs. So let us know why it's late, what are the steps that you need to take, and what a suitable release date would look like. That would be incredibly helpful. Thank you.
Thanks, Emily. Yes, that's exactly right. Let us know what you need, and then we can look at how to respond. And Ulrika has just put the email address in the chat for that sort of information. All right, thanks, Ulrika. Let's turn our attention now to the Foundation and Strategic Initiatives, and straight back to you, Ulrika. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. Okay, so I'm going to give a brief overview of an ongoing consultation on 3 of these foundational and strategic initiatives. Can we move to the next page, please? Thank you. So there are 3 initiatives that are currently being consulted on, and I'll give a very, very short overview of what they're about. So we're looking at identity and access management, which is essentially a digital uplift to how industry access AEMO services for example, in regards to authenticating participant users and applications when accessing our services. Industry data exchange, which address the current inconsistencies in standards and protocols for how data is exchanged between AEMO participants, with the view to provide a unified exchange platform. And then the portal consolidation, which is an improvement of among other things, the user experience in accessing browser-based services. So as noted by David earlier in the overview, these initiatives are a bit different from other reforms in that they're digital uplifts that have been identified by AEMO rather than the regular regulatory process as prerequisites to reforms on the roadmap, or as strategic future-proofing or cost-saving opportunities. And these initiatives that I've just talked about are at an initial stage, and as part of AEMO's roadmap, we're consulting with industry to develop a target state for these services, a transition strategy, and a business case. That business case will then be taken to the industry forum called Reform Delivery Committee for advice on whether and how and when we proceed with the implementation. So we're not actually talking about an initiative that's being implemented So there won't be an impact overview in the same way, but I might just talk through the consultation that is happening. So I think I'm covered the main points. Can we move on to the next slide, please? Thank you so much. Okay. Right. So this consultation is running from March through to approximately July this year. And it goes through an introduction, a discovery, and where we're looking at sort of industry and AEMO's pain points, so to speak, and the benefits of an uplift to capabilities. And after that, which is the current stage of the consultation, starting on Monday, we'll be discussing with industry potential target states for these new services. That will then lead us to a transition strategy conversation, finalized by conclusion and business case. And that is all to prepare us for that decision on whether these initiatives are going ahead. Okay, that's what I wanted to cover around the foundational and strategic initiatives. Are there any questions?
Great, thanks, Ulrika.
Thanks so much.
Okay, we'll hand back to Dave now to have a short discussion about next steps and how to get involved. Dave.
Great, thanks, Peter. So really, I think just recapping on what today's session is, that this was really intended to provide an overview of the NEM reform program and the initiatives and the impact to industry. So the intention there is really to equip stakeholders with sufficient information so that I guess you can all understand what these reforms are about, what they mean, and how they might impact your business. So the so what of this presentation really is around taking a moment to consider what the high level impacts are based on what we've identified. Obviously noting that we may not have as good a perspective. Well, we certainly will not have as good a perspective as you will have on referring to your own business needs and roles in the NEM. And so considering what those high level impacts are for your business would be the first task. Consider a more detailed impact assessment where it's appropriate to do so against those areas of operation, so that you can see what the implications are, and then think through the need to make timely system changes, processes, or engage, to Emily's point earlier, with our program at your next opportunity, whether it's through the forums and participation in some of our open forums, or whether it's directly contacting the NEM team, NEM reform at aemo.com.au directly, or the individual initiatives that are in flight. So really, it's about considering how to engage from here, considering what the impacts are from here on your business, and taking note of the timing and implementation timelines for the various initiatives that are in flight. Fully appreciate that we have presented you with a huge volume of data, and so hopefully these slides and the recording of this session will be a useful reference going forward, and can give you the time to digest some of the content that we've presented. Next slide, please, Leonard, and I'll just walk through the engagement format that we've set up for the NEM reform program. So this slide really is looking at the forums that we've got in place, and we've tried to kind of visually represent the resolution, if you like, that the different forums engage with participants at, the cadence of those forums, and the approach we've taken. So whether they're nomination or open, or just kind of as appropriate, which might be nomination or open. Looking at the first one, the executive forum, this is really around looking at that program level overview and status update. And so thinking about strategic questions like maybe how do we mobilize as an industry, like how do we coordinate the mobilization of these reforms more broadly, considering what AEMO's role is, considering what industry's role might be at an executive level. So looking at executive level participation there, we're yet to stand that forum up. We're looking at Q3 this year. We're still working through an agenda for that session. The intention is that we would operate that session twice a year, and it's by nomination. So for executives who might be interested in that, we're certainly open to nominations there. The Reform Delivery Committee, which we stood up in November 2021, that's looking at a long-term strategic perspective on the program. So looking at the roadmap level perspective for the NEM reform program, looking at in multiple years about how we sequence and prioritize and consider the delivery of this program over those time horizons. Stepping down to the program consultative forum, that looks at the in-flight initiatives and how we're kind of coordinating the delivery of those initiatives. So really looking at program status for the relevant initiatives that are in flight, and we have those sessions on at a monthly cadence, and they're open sessions. And certainly, for those who are interested, it's a good way to keep up to speed with where things are at in terms of in-flight initiatives and the current status and how things are tracking. We can step down then to the implementation forum. We're really down at the implementation timelines there, looking at in-flight initiatives, through the March releases would have been a focus for that implementation forum. The current May releases would be a key focus point for the implementation forum, and so on and so forth. And so that forum operates monthly. We've actually had 2 sessions last month, just given the nature of what we were dealing with the May releases. Again, an open session, a really useful place to step in and get a sense of where things are at for initiatives and reforms that are relevant to you and your business. The electricity wholesale and retail consultative forums, really they look at procedures, they're procedures working groups. They cover a lot of the procedural changes and documentation that we that are required to be changed as we implement these reforms. So all of the different procedures relevant to where they are relevant to reforms that need to be changed. Again, that's monthly. It's an open session and useful to step in and see where things are at that procedural level. Testing working groups for reforms that require the relevant testing approach. This is a good place to step in and see where things are at with respect of the testing of those initiatives. So in the lead up to the release of any initiatives that have that testing dimension to them, this is a good place to go to allocate either you or your relevant teams to provide, to gain some insight and updates on where things are at with respect of AEMO preparing that testing capability for participants. In terms of working groups, then these are really for in-flight initiatives. So, Ulrika has spoken just in the previous section to some of the working groups that have been stood up for these strategic and foundational initiatives, and they could be stood up, as I'm sure we're all familiar with, on the various initiatives as they're required. They can gain some, or it's a good opportunity for AEMO to work with participants and stakeholders who have that technical expertise, those technical insights, to help provide some really key insights and direction on some of our decision making. Those can be open sessions. They could be nomination sessions, depending on the nature of the content that we're dealing with. And so I guess it's just keeping up to speed and keeping an ear out for the initiatives that are afoot and whether or not there are opportunities to get involved there. So and I've just got some examples on screen there of the strategic and foundational working groups and the IT working groups that we have already in place. Now there's some links on this slide. We've got the NEM Reform Program Stakeholder Engagement link on the bottom right. That will take you to a page that provides further detail on all of these forums. So it's just our engagement structure. Feel free to check it out if you want any more information on any of these forums. And we've also got our industry meeting calendar. So what the schedule looks like for these sessions, again, available at the link in the bottom right. Also, do feel free and please do get in touch at the email address that we've provided. If you have any questions or queries, we can redirect you through that mailbox to the relative initiatives if you're feeling a bit lost in this program. And any questions and queries, we will do our best to address those in a timely manner. That was it from me, Peter. I'm happy to pause there if there's any queries on engagement and next steps.
Thanks, Dave. Appreciate that. Let's turn our attention now to Q&A. We have a question from earlier in the session that we'll deal with first, and that was a question from Siva. I'll just ask Greg Minnie to step in and respond to that. I'll just read the question out just to recap. Or you can, Greg. Away you go.
Yeah, I think Siva was asking if there was any expectation for MDPs to participate in industry testing for the 5-minute load profile change. Siva, at this stage, do not expect that to be a requirement. There's really no change to the way metadata is delivered for the implementation of this change. It's more about the profiling that is done within the AEMO systems and the presentation or the result of that as they flow through from settlement. So no expectation for MDPs to be required to be part of that industry test.
Thanks, Greg. Now, in relation to the Q&A, perhaps we'll turn to the next slide. We did ask for questions to be submitted beforehand. If you had any questions that were on your mind, we have allocated those questions, some to this session, which were more relevant to the general briefing, and some to the next section because they're more relevant to the roadmap briefing. Dave, I'll hand over to you to just give us a quick run through of the questions, and if anyone else has got any questions, feel free to pop them into the chat now, and we'll get through as many questions as we can by 3:10 when we will close.
Thanks, Peter. I'll just quickly pop through these. So yeah, as Peter said, we received a number of questions prior to this. And maybe these will help prompt some questions from the floor. So will AEMO consider extending the duration of market trials and more generally industry testing to allow for additional contingency using the lessons of previous initiatives? So really, I guess the answer here, AEMO will endeavour to plan for sufficient industry test market trial periods for each initiative. That will be in line with the period for that will be in line with the complexity and the extent of the changes required to AEMO and participant processes. So initiatives requiring market trials will have test periods greater where it's appropriate to do so. And where in industry, test periods are 4 weeks as planned. So milestones reflecting those planning assumptions are included in implementation plans and subject to participant feedback. So lessons from current and previous initiatives are also being taken on board in setting those times. So certainly a good opportunity to get involved in the implementation forums to give feedback on to AEMO as we work through some of their processes as well. But we do take a lot into consideration there. How will the reform program affect the staffing needs of market participants? What NEM changes will impact organizational structures, and how will organizations need to adapt? What human capital demands may be impacted by the reform program? So this will vary depending on market roles, the approach to participation and strategic direction. This is where we would call individual participants to assess the opportunity and impact of each of these reforms. And so as a starting point, you can use those high-level impact assessments that we've already mapped as part of the roadmap process, and AEMO intends to provide updated participant impacts assessments as each initiative goes through the implementation phase. Question 3, how settlement tables are going to get impacted out of the NEM reform program. So during the design phase of each initiative, impacts to participant interfaces, including settlement tables supported in the EMMS data model, are assessed, and updated versions of the data model and design and specifications are included as key deliverables or milestones for implementation. In terms of the final question, what is the current status of this program with reference to the timelines indicated for each initiative earlier? The status of the committed initiatives within the NEM reform program is reflected on slide 9 above. So I've spoken to some of the status components earlier in this presentation. Now, I might just take an opportunity to pop in a pulse survey as we go into the question chat. Peter, I hope you don't mind. I'll just drop it in the chat box. And this is just an opportunity for noting that we've got a very short time for questions and contributions from the floor. It's just an opportunity for the participants in this call to give some feedback on how they found this session and provide any additional feedback on what we can do better to help improve these processes going forward. There's also an opportunity to ask any additional questions based on the content you've seen today, and we'll do our best to get back to you. Apologies for that rushed run through. I'll hand back to you, Peter, and we can get a few minutes of question time on the clock.
Thanks, Dave. No, all good. In fact, no additional questions have come through in the chat. So I'm hoping that that means participants on the call have received the sort of information that they were hoping for. But if you were looking for or hoping for something else, please let us know via that quick pulse survey. It will only take a couple of minutes to complete. I think what we'll do is close this call now. We do have the roadmap session starting up in a few minutes' time. We will start the roadmap session at 3:15, and in the meantime, we'll close this call, and thanks to everyone for your participation and attendance today. Thank you.
Thanks all.
Thank you.